The air was made of glass. Every breath the men took seemed to shatter it, white mist blooming and fading like ghosts. The farmhouse walls groaned under the weight of frost. Outside, snow clung to the bodies of the fallen, Germans and British, both indistinguishable now beneath the uniform crust of ice. Time had slowed to a crawl, the kind that only comes in war when every second stretches into a lifetime. They were 6 men left in a platoon that had started with 34. The rest were gone, killed, captured, vanished in the forest mist that moved like smoke. Lieutenant Peter Shaw knew the silence too well. It was not peace. It was the kind of quiet that came before an avalanche, before the world decided to break again. He stood at the farmhouse doorway, staring into the dark beyond the field. The snow reflected a faint glow. German flares still hanging in the sky, slowly dying, trailing silver ashes as they fell. Somewhere out there, shapes moved between the trees. He thought he saw them, silhouettes shifting through fog, but it was impossible to tell where they ended and the forest began. Inside, Corporal Tom Hall stripped open a tin of frozen beans with his bayonet. The blade slipped, slicing his thumb. He didn't react. The blood came slow, thick, dark. He sucked it absently and passed the tin to Private Godfrey, who muttered a thanks without looking up. They ate in silence, chewing the frozen food like gravel. Every sound, the scrape of a spoon, the crunch of ice, felt dangerous, too loud. Shaw turned from the doorway. His voice was low, almost a whisper. No fires, no lights. If they spot us before dawn, we're finished. Hall nodded, wiping his hands on his trousers. Aye, sir. We're nearly out of ammo anyway. 2 magazines each, Godfrey said, eyes on the floor. And 2 grenades between us. The lieutenant's jaw clenched. He looked at the youngest among them, Private James Larkin, 19, freckles still visible under the grime. Larkin sat near the corner, clutching his rifle like a child with a toy he didn't know how to use. His gloves were gone, fingers raw and cracked. He kept staring at the floorboards as if the wood could save him. We hold until dawn, Shaw said again. The words came out heavy, ritualistic. Then we move west to rejoin the company. But the order... Hall started. Shaw cut him off. The order is to hold for 1 more hour. That was an hour ago. We'll give them till first light, then we go. Outside, a distant rumble rolled through the forest, a tank engine coughing to life. The men froze. It was close. Too close. The sound of gears grinding, treads biting through snow. A light flared between the trees, yellow and low. A German, Panzer IV, perhaps 200 yards away, sweeping its turret like an eye. The platoon pressed themselves to the ground, silent. Through a gap in the wall, Shaw could see the muzzle flash of the coaxial MG-34 as it spat tracer rounds into the night, cutting across the frozen fields. Somewhere out there, another group of British paratroopers were being hunted. Shaw's heart hammered. He whispered through clenched teeth, "Stay down, no movement, they'll pass." But the tank didn't pass. It slowed. The rumble deepened as it turned its hull toward them. The men could see the faint outline of German infantry advancing in its wake. Black shapes against the white field, rifles slung low, boots crunching in rhythm. The sound was unbearable. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to disappear into the snow. But there was nowhere to go. Shaw crawled toward the shattered window, peering through the frost. The Panzer stopped less than 100 meters from the farmhouse. Its turret lifted slightly. He knew what was coming. He could feel the vibrations before it happened. The deep, pulsing thud of the cannon firing. A heartbeat later, the shell struck the outer wall. The explosion tore through the night like the world splitting in half. The wall vanished in a spray of brick and flame. Snow turned to steam. Godfrey was thrown backward, his Bren gun skittering across the floor. Hall dragged him behind a pile of sandbags as debris rained down. Shaw felt the shockwave in his chest, a force that seemed to stop his heart for a second too long. Smoke filled the room. The light was gone. The world was a blur of black shapes and red afterglow. Someone screamed. A short, raw sound, then silence again. Shaw's ears rang. He tried to shout orders, but no words came out. His vision swam. He could taste blood. When he came to, the farmhouse was half collapsed. Fire licked through the wreckage, casting mad shadows on the snow. The tank had stopped firing. The Germans were shouting now, voices in guttural rhythm, boots pounding through snowdrift. They were closing in. Hall appeared through the smoke, dragging Larkin, who was bleeding from the leg. "They're flanking us, sir." Shaw stumbled to his feet. His head throbbed. He could hear the faint clatter of their last magazines being loaded. "Positions!" he barked, his voice breaking. Godfrey crawled to the shattered window, setting the Bren gun on the sill. "I'll cover the left." Hall took the right, his Sten gun trembling in his hands. Shaw crouched in the center, fumbling for his pistol. Larkin lay on the floor, white-faced, whispering prayers no one could hear. Outside, the German squad broke from the trees, dark figures moving fast across the open snow. The Bren gun roared, cutting them down in bursts of flame. Snow exploded in fountains. Two fell instantly, one screaming as he hit the ground. The others dropped to their knees, returning fire. Bullets punched through the wooden walls, splinters flying. A round tore through the sleeve of Shaw's coat. Another struck the lamp behind him, plunging the room into near-total darkness. "Keep firing," Shaw shouted. The air turned to thunder. Smoke and snow mixed into one choking storm. The smell of cordite filled their lungs. Godfrey cursed as the Bren jammed, the cold seizing the mechanism. He smacked it with his palm, cleared it, fired again. Hall's Sten clicked empty. He grabbed a rifle from the floor, fired wildly into the night. Then, silence. Just wind. The Germans were gone. Shaw leaned against the wall, chest heaving, ears ringing. The fire outside was dimming, shadows flickering across the snow. Hall slid down beside him, breathing hard. "We can't hold another one of those." Shaw looked at his watch again, cracked, frozen, but he could still make out the faint glint of the hour hand. It was 05:37, 23 minutes till dawn. "Just one more hour," he muttered. Always one more hour. He stepped outside into the freezing dark. The sky was faintly gray now, the first hint of morning behind the smoke. The field was littered with bodies, black against the snow. Steam rose from the tank's engine as it sat still, empty now, abandoned. He could hear the distant rumble of British artillery, maybe miles away, maybe just over the ridge. He couldn't tell any more. Sound was a liar in the snow. He turned, back toward the farmhouse, toward what was left of his platoon. They had fought for a patch of earth barely the size of a tennis court, and somehow they were still breathing. But he knew this was not victory. It was survival, stripped of its glory, the kind of survival that haunted men for decades. Inside, Larkin had stopped whispering. His head was turned toward the wall, eyes half open. Hall covered him with a blanket and said nothing. Shaw knelt, closing the boy's eyes with his gloved hand. He looked older than his years now, not from time, but from everything it had taken from him. "We'll carry him," he said quietly. "When the light comes." Godfrey nodded. "And if the Krauts come first?" Shaw didn't answer. He looked out the window again to the ridge where the trees met the pale sky. Somewhere beyond that line there were still Allied units pushing east, still men fighting, still maps being drawn. Maybe someone would remember this place one day. Maybe not. The snow began to fall again, soft and slow. It covered everything. Blood, boots, broken rifles, until the world looked clean once more. And in that brief, fragile quiet, the 6th Airborne's last platoon waited for dawn. The first light of day did not arrive like morning. It arrived like confession. Gray, soft, unmerciful. It revealed everything the night had hidden. The blackened timber, the frozen bodies, the way the snow had melted into streaks of crimson where men had fallen. Lieutenant Peter Shaw stood in the open doorway, his rifle slung but useless, eyes fixed on the ridgeline. The wind hissed through the burned rafters behind him. He could hear Godfrey and Hall arguing in hushed voices about whether the tank might still be crewed. Every few seconds one of them would pause, listening, because silence itself had become suspicious. The order still hung in the air like a curse. Hold for 1 more hour. Shaw replayed the transmission in his head, the thin, metallic voice of battalion command cutting through the static at 03:47 hours, moments before the radio died. No context, no reinforcement. Just the command and the faith that somewhere beyond the frost and the fog, someone still believed they were alive. He wondered if command even knew this farmhouse existed. The dawn was colorless. Smoke drifted low across the fields, carried from the direction of WWII, where British and Canadian troops were still fighting through the ruins. The Germans were falling back, or so the rumors said, but rumors did not warm the hands or feed the stomach. Shaw's men hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. Their water tins were frozen solid. When they spoke, frost formed on their lips. Godfrey crouched by the Bren gun, scanning the tree line through the sight. His breath plumed from the muzzle like smoke from a dying engine. "They'll come again, sir. They always come after a bombardment. Clean up the wreckage." Shaw nodded. "They'll expect us to be dead. Let's not disappoint them." Hall barked a short laugh that turned into a cough. His lungs rattled. The cold had settled there, deep and wet. "We've already disappointed bloody everyone else." Shaw didn't smile. He looked down at Larkin's covered body, the blanket stiff with frost. "We'll move him when we can." At 06:15 hours, a faint metallic click broke the morning. Godfrey swung the Bren toward the sound, finger tense on the trigger. A figure stumbled through the snow line, a man in a torn Dennison smock, helmet askew, hands raised. For a breath, all rifles turned on him. "Don't shoot." "British D Company!" It was Private Ed Kershaw, one of the runners sent the night before. His face was gray with exhaustion. His left arm hung useless. He collapsed at Shaw's feet, gasping. Shaw knelt beside him, tearing open his collar to check the pulse. "Christ, Ed, where have you been?" Kershaw coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Got caught in it, sir. Mortars. Half the section's gone." But message came through. "Colonel Stevens says..." He tried to sit up, voice breaking. "Says hold this ridge till 0900. Reinforcements coming from Boer," Hall muttered under his breath. Another bloody hour. Shaw felt the words land like stones. 0900. An order wasn't a request. It was a chain. And every link pulled tighter. "All right," he said quietly. "Then we hold till 0900. By 07 hours, the snow had begun again, thick and heavy. Visibility dropped to 50 yards. The men fortified what was left of the wall with sandbags and debris. Shaw moved between them, checking weapons, speaking softly, not because there was anything new to say, but because his voice was the last thing keeping them tethered to the living. He passed Larkin's blanket on his way to the door. For a moment he stopped, adjusting the edge so it wouldn't blow open. The gesture was almost tender. Then he stepped back into the cold. Through the curtain of falling snow he saw movement. Not German patrols this time, but crows, black against the white, circling low over the field. The dead had drawn their own sentries. At 07:23, the Panzer IV on the ridge coughed again. Its engine rattled to life with a slow growl that cut through the storm. The men froze. The turret shifted, deliberate, searching. A second later came the high-pitched chatter of an MG-42. Short bursts testing. Tracers carved orange scars through the air, sparking against the farmhouse stones. Godfrey squeezed off controlled fire from the Bren, ducking back as bullets punched through the shutters. "They're probing us, sir." "Then let them see we're still here," Shaw said. He leaned into the window frame and fired his pistol once just to answer. The shot sounded pitiful against the roar of the machine gun, but it meant something. It said not yet. For 30 minutes the firefight pulsed in and out, bursts of sound swallowed by snow. The Germans advanced cautiously, their gray coats blending with the storm. Hall lobbed one of their last grenades into a cluster of movement, the blast throwing up a plume of white and smoke. The echo rolled down the valley like thunder. When silence came again, it was thicker than before. 8:05 hours. The farmhouse was barely standing. Smoke bled from the roof beams. Powder snow fell through the holes like ash. Godfrey's fingers were too numb to reload. Hall's Sten was empty. Kershaw lay unconscious near the wall, pulse weak but steady. Shaw stared at his watch again. The second hand had resumed moving, though he didn't remember when. 45 minutes. Hold for 1 more hour. He looked at each of them in turn. We're not dying here. When I say move, we head for the tree line. West. No talking. If anyone falls, we keep going. Understood? They nodded. There was no debate left in them. Outside, the storm eased. The world softened into a pale silence. Shaw risked a glance through the doorway and froze. Out on the field, barely visible through the haze, came figures in white smocks. German winter camouflage. Half a dozen at first, then more. They moved slowly, rifles raised, advancing in formation. Behind them, the tank lurched forward once more. Shaw's heart tightened. Positions. The platoon opened fire. The battle was a whisper compared to the night before, but it was enough. Bullets tore into the snow, kicking up clouds that hid friend and foe alike. Godfrey's Bren rattled its last belt before jamming solid. Hall screamed as splinters tore across his cheek. Shaw fired until his pistol clicked empty, then grabbed Larkin's rifle from beside the blanket and kept shooting. The Germans broke formation, diving for cover. One tossed a grenade, a metallic arc through the air. It landed near the doorway. Down! The explosion blew Shaw backward. His ears went hollow. He felt himself hit the floor, breath gone. When the ringing cleared, he saw Hall crawling toward him, dragging him by the webbing. Up, sir, up. Through the smoke, Shaw could see the Panzer's turret swinging. Its barrel aligned with the ruin. He felt the deep rumble of ignition. Time slowed, seconds turning to syrup. Then the world erupted. He woke beneath snow. The roof had collapsed. The sky above was a blur of gray and drifting white. Everything hurt, his leg, his ribs, his head. Voices reached him dimly through the snow. Hall's, maybe. Godfrey's. He forced his arm free, clawing upward until daylight pierced through. A hand grabbed his wrist, hauling him into the open. It was Hall, and face bloodied, uniform black with soot. They've gone, Hall rasped. Tank pulled back. Think we hit their fuel line. Shaw looked around. The farmhouse was gone. Only a skeleton of beams and smoke remained. Godfrey knelt nearby, trying to revive Kershaw, who wasn't moving. The wind howled through the broken timbers. Shaw coughed, tasting dust and iron. Time? Hall checked his watch. 8:55, 5 minutes. 5 minutes to the hour. Shaw stared toward the west, toward the road to Bure. There, faint but real, he saw movement. Dark shapes emerging through the snow, not German gray, but khaki and maroon. A jeep, half-track, men with red berets flashing in the pale light. British, relief. Salvation carved in motion. He almost laughed, but it came out as a choke. You see them? Godfrey turned, squinting. Then he smiled, the first real smile Shaw had seen in days. Aye, sir. That's us. Hall slumped to his knees, the adrenaline finally gone. Bloody hell, we actually did it. Shaw just stood there, numb. The snow stung his face, but he couldn't feel it. He looked back at the ruin behind them, at Larkin's blanket half buried, at the scattered weapons, at the blackened doorway where men had held the line against the impossible. He whispered the words that had carried them through the night. Hold for one more hour. And for the first time, the hour was over. The relief column reached them minutes later. Medics spilling from the half-track, voices sharp and urgent. The wounded were loaded, the dead counted. A major from HQ climbed from the jeep, his uniform immaculate despite the mud. Lieutenant Shaw? Shaw straightened, saluting out of reflex. Orders received, the major said briskly. You held the ridge, well done. You'll be pulled back to Dinant for rest. Shaw nodded but said nothing. He looked past the major to the horizon, where the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. Its light fell on the snow like forgiveness. But forgiveness, he knew, was for the living. And the living would carry this hour forever. The engines were the first human sound they had heard in 48 hours. They came crawling up the ridge like metal beasts, grumbling and coughing, the smell of oil thick in the frozen air. Men leaned from the sides of half-tracks, scarves whipped by wind, eyes scanning the wreckage for movement. The 6th Airborne survivors rose from the snow like ghosts, their faces pale, lips split, uniforms shredded. No cheers, no shouts, just silent recognition between men who understood too well the difference between surviving and living. Lieutenant Peter Shaw limped forward to meet them, his leg bound in a torn field dressing. He could barely feel his foot. A medic grabbed his arm, checking for wounds, but Shaw waved him off. Tend to the others first, he said. Hall's hit in the chest. Godfrey's hands are frostbitten. Kershaw didn't make it. The medic nodded grimly and moved past him. Shaw turned, watching as Hall was lifted onto a stretcher, his face a mask of stubborn disbelief. The man tried to joke. "Told you I wasn't made for winter holidays," but his voice broke halfway through. Godfrey followed, fingers blackened, Bren gun still slung over his shoulder as if he couldn't let go of it. Snowflakes fell thickly, sticking to the blood that streaked the men's coats. The relief column commander, Major Arthur Kelso, 6th Airborne HQ, climbed from his jeep, shaking Shaw's hand with a firm grip that felt more like a confession than gratitude. "You did well, Lieutenant. You held longer than anyone had the right to." Shaw looked past him to the ridge now covered in smoke and silence. "Did we?" he said softly. "I can't tell anymore." Kelso followed his gaze. The farmhouse was gone, reduced to ash and black ice. The field was a graveyard of iron and men. He didn't answer. By nightfall, they were back near Bura. The village was a ruin. Roofs collapsed, walls cracked open by tank shells, windows blackened with soot. What few civilians remained moved like phantoms through the rubble, carrying buckets of melted snow, faces hollow from weeks of shelling. British and Canadian units were still fighting street to street, pushing what remained of the 2nd Panzer Division east toward Groupont. The smell of gunpowder clung to everything, even the snow. Shaw's platoon, and what was left of it, was quartered in the skeleton of a schoolhouse. The chalkboards were shattered, children's drawings still faintly visible beneath dust and bullet holes. He sat at a broken desk, head bowed, writing by candlelight in the corner. His handwriting was cramped and uneven, each letter pressed too hard into the paper. January 9th, 1945. We held the ridge. Larkin, Kershaw, Atwell, Baines gone. Godfrey wounded. Hall stable. 6 of us left from 34. Orders carried out. Enemy withdrew. I keep hearing the order in my head. Hold for 1 more hour. 1 hour. It feels like the longest in history. He stopped writing and stared at the page until the ink bled through. The candle guttered. Outside, he could hear the distant rumble of tanks moving east. He wondered if the next men who received an order like that would understand what it truly meant. Not bravery, not obedience, but the raw endurance of fear stretched to breaking. The next morning, reinforcements arrived from Dinant, fresh faces, unscarred, boots still black, rifles polished. They looked like children. Shaw stood with Kelso as the new men disembarked from their trucks, laughing and smoking, the way every soldier did before they saw what the war really was. 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, Kelso said. They'll take over the ridge. You'll be pulled back to rest. Shaw nodded, but his eyes stayed on the men. They don't know, he murmured. No one does, Kelso said. Not until it's too late. They walked through the village, past burned-out Sherman tanks and horses frozen where they'd fallen. A church bell hung sideways in its tower, the ropes burned away. Children watched from doorways, their faces pale, eyes too old for their years. Shaw paused, digging into his coat pocket. He pulled out a single chocolate ration and handed it to one of them. A girl, maybe 7 or 8. She didn't smile. She just took it and disappeared back into the shadows. By midday, Shaw and his remaining men were loaded into the back of a Bedford truck bound for the rear lines. The road wound through the forest, narrow and treacherous, snow still falling in thick sheets. The men sat in silence, wrapped in blankets that smelled of petrol. Every bump in the road made Shaw's ribs ache. Godfrey sat beside him, staring at his hands, which were now wrapped in white bandages. Doctor says they might have to take a finger or two, he muttered. Better than all of them, I suppose. Shaw managed a faint smile. You'll still pull a trigger. Maybe. Or play piano in a pub if we ever get home. They both knew neither of those futures felt real. The truck rattled on, carrying them through a forest stripped bare by artillery. Trees stood like bones, black against white. In the distance, the sky glowed orange where the front still burned. They reached the town of Dinant by nightfall. It was a strange kind of peace, too quiet, too clean. The officers were billeted in a commandeered manner overlooking the Meuse River, the same river they had crossed in triumph months earlier during the advance toward the Rhine. Now it looked different, slower, darker, carrying bits of ice downstream like ghosts. Shaw stood at the window, the faint reflection of his own face staring back. He looked older, harder. The youth that had once made him a paratrooper, reckless, quick to laugh, hungry for the sky, had been carved away by snow and fire. In its place was something heavier, stillness, the kind that never leaves. He could hear the men downstairs talking softly, their voices rising and falling like a tide. For the first time in days, they had heat, real food, whiskey. It should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt like exile. Later that night, Major Kelso joined him by the window. Both men stared at the river without speaking for a while. The silence between soldiers who have seen too much is never empty. It's full of everything they can't say. Kelso finally spoke. "You'll be recommended for the military cross, your platoon too." Shaw didn't turn. "For what? Following orders? For holding the line when it mattered?" He said nothing. The words "when it mattered" echoed through him like a shell burst. He thought of Larkin's body under the blanket, of the tank's silhouette in the snow, of the sound of Hall coughing blood. When it mattered, and what did that even mean? The war didn't care about moments. It just consumed them. Kelso sighed. "Go home when they give you leave, Shaw. You've earned it. Home." The word was foreign now, like a place he had only imagined. "When this is over," Shaw said, "I'll go to the sea. Just stand there and listen. No orders, no noise. Just water." Kelso smiled faintly. "Then you'll be one of the lucky ones." The next morning brought fresh orders. The 6th Airborne Division was to regroup and prepare for Operation Varsity, the final airborne assault across the Rhine. Shaw read the message twice before folding it carefully into his pocket. "So that's it," he said to Hall, who sat smoking on the steps. "The war's not done with us yet." Hall exhaled, the smoke mingling with his breath. "It never is, sir. It just changes its name." They both laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that doesn't reach the eyes. Outside, snow was still falling over Dinant. The town's bells rang weakly, their sound carried by wind across the river. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Germany, and the next chapter of their story, one written not in glory but in endurance. Shaw turned back toward the window. The Meuse glimmered faintly in the dawn. He thought again of the order that had kept them alive, hold for one more hour, and realized that in war, every hour is just another borrowed minute from eternity. The snow had barely melted when the next order arrived. It came in a manila envelope, hand-delivered to the temporary headquarters in Dinant, marked Top Secret, Operation Varsity. Lieutenant Peter Shaw stared at it across the table, the ink still wet from the courier's pen. The last one-sentence command, "hold for one more hour," had nearly killed his platoon. Now another had arrived, carrying the weight of an entire division's fate. Major Kelso stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. The words were clinical, as all orders were. 6th Airborne Division to reconstitute and prepare for airborne assault across the Rhine River. Vicinity Wesel. Objective: secure Eastern Bank and facilitate link-up with advancing ground forces. D-Day, March 24, 1945. Shaw's eyes moved down the page to the line that mattered. No withdrawal authorized. All positions to be held at all costs, that phrase. It was the same spirit as before. Hold until death or victory made the distinction for you. He folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the field clock on the wall. The war had entered its last act and everyone knew it. Germany was crumbling, but the Wehrmacht still fought like a cornered animal. Shaw felt the unease crawl under his skin. He had seen too much to believe in final pushes. The war always had one more hour left in it. That night, the platoon sat around a makeshift stove in what had once been a music room. The cracked piano in the corner still carried the ghost of melody when the wind blew through it. They passed around a bottle of whiskey scavenged from an officer's mess, each man taking a swallow like communion. Hall sat with his back to the stove, his chest bandaged, eyes heavy. "Across the Rhine," he said, half to himself. "Bloody hell, I thought we'd done our share." Godfrey, his hands still wrapped in white gauze, managed to grin. Maybe the brass figures were experts at freezing to death. The men laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter was the only thing left between them and madness. Shaw smiled faintly, though his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of the order again, of how easily those words were written compared to how painfully they were obeyed. When the laughter faded, Hall looked at him. "Sir, that order at Bure. Hold for one more hour." You ever wonder if someone just said that because they didn't know what else to say? Shaw met his gaze. "Every day," Hall nodded slowly. "Thought so." The stove popped, sending sparks into the air. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and endless, as if the world itself refused to let them leave winter behind. Over the next weeks, the 6th Airborne Division rebuilt itself piece by piece. New recruits arrived, boys with unscuffed boots and clean hands, joining veterans who looked twice their age. They trained in fields near the Meuse, practicing night drops and bridge assaults, running drills until their bodies gave out. The wind coming off the river carried the smell of thawing mud and cordite. Spring was coming, but it was the kind that belonged only to soldiers. A false warmth before the next storm. Shaw led his men through every exercise, his limp worsening, but his resolve sharpening. He could feel the hourglass turning again. Orders didn't just tell you what to do. They changed you. They rewrote the body, the mind, the soul. Every man who had survived the ridge now moved differently, slower, quieter, as if afraid the earth itself might break under their boots. One evening, after a long march, Shaw found himself alone by the riverbank. The sun was setting, the water catching fire with reflected light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his watch, the same one that had frozen in the farmhouse, its glass cracked. He wound it gently, listening to the faint tick resume. Still working, he thought. Still holding time even after everything. The sound of footsteps drew him back. Kelso approached, cigarette smoke trailing. "You should be resting, Shaw." "Rest feels unnatural now," Shaw said. "Too quiet." Kelso smiled, weary. "You've changed. So have we all." "True, but some changes don't fade when the fighting stops." Shaw looked at him, the fading light reflecting in his eyes. "You think it ever really stops?" Kelso didn't answer. He dropped his cigarette into the river and watched it vanish beneath the current. March 23rd, 1945, the eve of the operation. The airfield near Coulommiers was alive with noise. The roar of engines, the clatter of boots on metal ramps, the shouted codes of paratroopers loading for the jump. C-47 Dakotas lined the runways like steel birds waiting for dawn. Shaw's platoon stood among hundreds of others, faces painted black, gear checked and rechecked in ritual precision. The air was electric with tension, the kind that comes before the fall. Hall tightened his harness, grinning despite the fear. "Another fine day for suicide, eh, sir?" "Just another hour to hold," Shaw replied, smiling thinly. When the green flare went up, they climbed aboard. Inside the aircraft, the smell of oil and canvas mixed with sweat and nerves. The engines thundered to life, vibrating through every bone. Shaw sat by the open door, wind whipping against his face, staring out at the endless dark. Somewhere beyond it lay the Rhine, the last great river before the heart of Germany. A young private beside him crossed himself and whispered, "If we make it, sir." "Does that mean we've done enough?" Shaw didn't look away from the night. "In war," he said quietly, "there's no such thing as enough." The red light flashed. The cabin filled with breathless silence. Then came the green. They jumped. The air was chaos. Tracer fire arcing like burning comets, flak exploding in clouds of black smoke, parachutes blooming across the sky like dying flowers. Shaw's chute yanked him upward, cutting into his ribs. He twisted in the air, the wind roaring in his ears. Below him, the Rhine glimmered silver under the moonlight, the far bank already alive with muzzle flashes. He hit the ground hard, rolling through mud and snow. Gunfire cracked nearby. Men shouted, scattered, regrouped. The field was a storm of light and shadow. Shaw tore free of his harness and crawled toward the sound of voices. His platoon, or what pieces of it, had landed near him. "Godfrey!" "Hall!" he shouted. A figure appeared through smoke. Godfrey, one hand clutching his rifle, the other still bandaged. "Here, sir." Hall followed, limping, helmet gone. "Welcome to bloody Germany." They regrouped behind a hedgerow, hearts pounding. Ahead lay their objective, a farmhouse by the river, its roof burning, Germans firing from the upper windows. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Another farmhouse. Another stand. Another hour to hold. "Déjà vu," Hall muttered. "Think this one's haunted too?" Shaw raised his rifle. "We'll find out." They advanced through the smoke, moving low and fast. Grenades shattered the walls, fire roaring through the upper floor. The Germans fell back, their shouts muffled by gunfire. Within minutes, the farmhouse was theirs, half destroyed but defensible. Shaw looked around, breathing hard. "Positions. Get the Bren up. They'll counterattack." Godfrey nodded, setting up at the window. The others took cover behind overturned tables, scanning the tree line. Through the haze, they could see enemy infantry regrouping by the riverbank. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Shaw checked his watch. 03:10 hours. He felt the chill crawl down his spine. Hold for one more hour. The battle for the Rhine raged in fragments. Fields, barns, orchards turned into islands of death. Every minute stretched into eternity. German mortar rounds whistled overhead, slamming into the ground with deafening concussions. The farmhouse shook with each blast. Godfrey's bren chattered until it ran dry. Then he switched to his sidearm. Hall reloaded, teeth bared, shouting over the noise. They're pushing through the orchard. Shaw leaned from the window, firing into the dark. The muzzle flash lit his face in bursts of orange. A round tore past his shoulder, splintering the wall. The air was filled with the whine of ricochets, the screams of the wounded, the relentless rhythm of machine guns. Then, suddenly, quiet. The kind of silence that comes only after the impossible has been endured. The Germans withdrew. Smoke drifted through the doorway, curling like ghosts around the beams. Shaw stood in the wreckage, breathing hard, watching the horizon begin to glow faintly with dawn. The Rhine lay behind them now, its far bank secured. The 6th Airborne had done it. They had crossed the last river. Hall slumped against the wall, exhausted. "We did it again," he muttered. Held another bloody hour. Shaw didn't answer. He looked down at his hands, trembling, blackened with soot, and thought of all the men who hadn't made it across. Larkin, Kershaw. Too many names for one heart to hold. He stepped outside. The air was cold and clean, the first rays of sunlight piercing the smoke. Across the field, British tanks were rolling up the road, their engines roaring like salvation. The sight should have filled him with pride, but instead it filled him with a kind of grief he couldn't name, because he knew now what holding for one more hour really meant. It wasn't about obedience or victory. It was about sacrifice measured in minutes, the kind of minutes that built empires and destroyed souls. Kelso found him later that morning walking through the wreckage. "You're alive," the major said simply. "For now." Kelso clapped a hand on his shoulder. "The Rhine's ours. It's over." Shaw looked out at the river where sunlight danced on the surface like fire. "No," he said softly. "It's never over. We just stopped counting the hours." Weeks later, when the guns finally fell silent and the division was pulled back from Germany, Shaw wrote one last entry in his notebook. The ink bled slightly from rain, but the words were steady. March 1945, the order changed everything. Not the one written on paper, but the one we carried in our blood. To endure. The world will remember victory, but I will remember the silence that followed it. He closed the book and set it on the windowsill of yet another broken house. Outside, spring was breaking through the frost. Flowers pushing through the ruins, rivers running free again. Somewhere a church bell rang. The war was ending. Shaw stood for a long time, the sunlight warming his face. Then, almost without realizing, he whispered the words that had haunted every man of the 6th Airborne. Hold for one more hour. And this time, he smiled. When the guns finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than the war itself. The Rhine gleamed behind them like a scar. Calm, indifferent, eternal. For the men of the 6th Airborne, victory didn't come with cheering or bands, but with a strange absence, no more orders, no more hours to hold. Lieutenant Peter Shaw walked through the ruins of Wessel with his helmet tucked under his arm, his breath fogging the spring air. The town smelled of dust, burned brick, and rain. Columns of prisoners shuffled past under guard. Women watched from doorways, faces hollow but dry-eyed. The war was ending, but ending was not peace, and it was an unraveling. He stopped beside a fountain cracked in half by artillery. Water still trickled through the break, collecting in a shallow pool clouded with ash. He knelt, cupped his hands, and drank. The water was cold and tasted of iron. When he looked up, the clouds were breaking apart, and for the first time in months he could see the blue of the sky. He realized he had forgotten what blue looked like. Behind him, Corporal Tom Hall limped across the square, his coat torn, his bandages yellowing. "Orders from HQ," he called out, waving a folded paper. "They're sending us home, England. Embarkation in 3 days. Home." The word landed like something foreign. Shaw rose slowly. "Home," he repeated as if testing its meaning. Hall grinned, though the smile never reached his eyes. "You think you'll know what to do there, sir?" Shaw glanced around, at the rubble, the children scouring ruins for scraps, the wind stirring the ashes. Not anymore. The journey back the road to the coast was lined with reminders of what victory cost. Burned armor rusted in ditches, white flags hung from shattered windows, and fields were littered with the ghosts of armies. Convoys rolled westward in endless procession, trucks packed with men, jeeps towing broken guns, ambulances full of those who would never walk again. The 6th Airborne traveled in open lorries through Holland's thawing fields. The smell of mud and diesel filled the air. They passed through villages half rebuilt, where Dutch civilians waved Union Jacks stitched from curtains and sang with cracked voices. The men smiled, but their eyes stayed empty. They had forgotten how to receive gratitude. At night, they camped near the river crossings. Fires burned low, their glow flickering across faces too young to be so old. Shaw sat apart, notebook open on his knee. The pages were filled with names, dates, fragments of thought, nothing in order, as if meaning itself had been shelled to pieces. He wrote a line and stopped, staring at the ink as it spread. We lived in ours. We died in them too. Hall wandered over, carrying 2 tins of tea. He handed one across. You still writing, sir? Trying. What about? Everything I don't want to forget. Which is everything I already have. Hall nodded, blew on his tea. Maybe that's for the best. They sat in silence while the river whispered past, carrying reflections of fire and stars. Somewhere down the bank, Godfrey was telling a new group of recruits about WWII, how they'd held when no one thought they could. The story had already become myth, softened around the edges. Shaw listened, realizing that stories are what replace truth when truth is too heavy to bear. Arrival in England, the Channel crossing was quiet. The sea was smooth, the air clear. Men leaned against the railings, smoking in silence, watching the coastline of France fade into mist. When England appeared, green hills beneath a pale sun, a few cheered but most simply stared. They had come full circle to a place that no longer matched the one they'd left. Shaw stepped off the landing craft at Portsmouth and felt the solid ground beneath his boots. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke, familiar yet strange. Bands played somewhere beyond the docks. Civilians waved flags. He kept walking. Within hours, the 6th Airborne was billeted in barracks outside Aldershot. The bunks were clean, the food warm. Men slept for 18 hours straight, some crying out in dreams, others not waking at all until shaken. The army doctors called it combat exhaustion. Shaw called it the silence catching up. He was summoned to headquarters the next morning. A colonel he'd never met congratulated him, handed him a small box containing the military cross, and dictated a citation about extraordinary leadership under extreme adversity. Shaw accepted it with the same expression he'd used for field orders, calm, distant, polite. When the colonel offered his hand, Shaw hesitated before taking it. Outside, Hall waited by the steps, smoking. Got your medal, then? Shaw pocketed the box. They give medals for survival now. They always did. They walked together toward the parade ground. A light rain was falling, gentle and persistent. Hall tilted his head back, eyes closed. Smells different here, doesn't it? Clean, Shaw nodded. Almost too clean. The home front Shaw's leave papers came 2 days later. He took a train south through green fields and sleeping villages. The countryside looked untouched by war, as if nothing had happened beyond the horizon. Children waved at the passing carriages. Women hung laundry in sunlight. It all felt impossible. When he stepped off at Canterbury Station, no one was waiting. He walked the road to his family's farm alone, the same road he'd walked before enlisting. The hedgerows were blooming again. The smell of earth and wet grass filled the air. His mother opened the door before he could knock. She didn't speak, just reached out and held him. For a moment he was no officer, no survivor, just her son returned from the edge of the world. When she pulled back, she studied his face, tracing the lines that hadn't been there before. You've come home thin, she said softly. Everyone has, he replied. That night they ate by the fire. The radio played quietly, news of Germany's surrender, Churchill's voice echoing through the static. His mother cried quietly, not for victory but for everything it had cost. Shaw sat in silence, staring into the flames, hearing again the whispers of snow and gunfire, the voice over the radio. Hold for one more hour. Echoes of war weeks past. The world celebrated. London filled with parades and flags. Strangers kissed in the streets. Shaw couldn't bring himself to go. He spent his days working the land, mending fences, pretending the rhythm of ordinary life could overwrite the sound of war. But at night he woke sweating, heart hammering, the scent of cordite still in his lungs. He tried to write again, letters to families of the men who hadn't come back. Each began the same way. Your son fought bravely. He did his duty. He held his ground until the very end. He never mentioned the fear, the cold, the way death had smelled of iron and snow. The truth was too cruel to send by post. One evening he visited Hall in London. Hall had found work driving lorries, his limp worse but his spirit somehow brighter. They met in a smoky pub near Paddington, the room thick with laughter and victory songs. Hall raised a glass. To the lads who made it and the ones who didn't. They drank in silence for a moment. Then Hall leaned closer. You ever think about going back, sir? Staying in the army? Shaw shook his head. The war took everything it needed from me. I've got nothing left to give, Hall smiled sadly. That's what I thought. Then I woke up missing it, and the noise, the madness, the feeling that every minute mattered. That's the curse, Shaw said. You spend years wanting it to end, and when it does, you can't remember who you were without it. They parted on the street outside. Rain fell lightly, shining in the lamplight. Hall saluted half-heartedly. Take care, sir. You too, Tom. They would never see each other again. The letter autumn came. The fields turned gold. One morning, Shaw received a letter stamped with the seal of the 6th Airborne. It was from Major Kelso Peter. The division is to be disbanded. Some men will transfer to the occupation forces, others home for good. They're asking for after-action accounts of Bure. The hold for one more hour order. Thought you might want to know they're calling it one of the division's proudest moments. Hope you're finding peace where you are. If not, keep holding. It gets easier. Kelso Shaw read it twice, then set it beside his notebook. The words proudest moment felt strange. Pride had nothing to do with what had happened in that frozen farmhouse. It was endurance, not glory. He walked outside into the fading light, the wind stirring leaves around his boots. The sky was the same pale gray it had been that morning in 1945. He realized that the order had never really ended. The world kept giving it to him in new forms. Hold for one more day, one more season, one more memory. The return to the Ridge in 1950, 5 years after the war, Shaw returned to Belgium. He traveled alone by train and then by foot, following the same route through the Ardennes that had once been lined with fire. The forests had grown back green and quiet. Villagers had rebuilt their homes. Children played where tanks had burned. He found the ridge above Bure by instinct, guided by something deeper than maps. The farmhouse was gone. Only a few stones remained, half buried in grass.